On the podcast today, we are going to speak about wandering as a spiritual practice. And wandering is actually a central theme in Taoism, Buddhism, and also the yogic traditions, and also Jainism.
Yeah, the hermit tradition.
The hermit traditions, yes. And so, particularly in Taoism, we find wandering littered through the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, this sense of aimlessness. But there's a difference to some of the philosophy here with what we're talking about, because in Taoism, this wandering as a spiritual practice is what we would refer to as cloud wandering, which is different to free and easy wandering, which is Xiao Yao Yu. Xiao Yao Yu is actually kind of a state of consciousness that happens after spiritual liberation, which is the same in Japanese as unsui. Unsui means to drift like a cloud and flow like water. So they can both, seemingly refer to wandering, but they're more of a state of consciousness after liberation, where what we're talking particularly about today is cloud wandering. So the actual practice of wandering as a spiritual practice.
It's not only mental wandering, also physical
wandering. Yes.
That's also what we're talking about.
Yeah,
here.
Mainly physical wandering is what cloud wandering is referring to. And we find this in the yogic traditions as well, as I said. And we find this in the Shramana traditions of Jainism and Buddhism. So you'll often hear the story of the Buddha, for example, the historical Buddha, Gautama the Buddha. He would just walk in straight lines and just would wander without a care in the world about, some of the Shramanas would go, they would know there's a city there, so they know if they walk on this road, they can get some food in the next town. But the Buddha is, he was pretty ardent in his spiritual practice, so he would just walk in straight lines, over mountains and through jungles and whatever came to him. So, and that's part of the Shramana tradition. So, and this cloud wandering practice is something that it's very close to you and I, because most of our life together, we have been kind of cloud wandering around, gallivanting around, particularly in Asia, and only in the last couple of years, due to the situation, have we been sort of stuck in one place for longer than probably we would like.
Yeah, I mean, it's been longest ever since I basically left home, I think, this time period. It's been, I think so. It's a wandering around physically as well as mentally, obviously. That is knowingly, unknowingly, I think it's a kind of spiritual initiation somewhat, like the first initiation that you go through the process of this path of your spiritual practice. And again, that happens knowingly, unknowingly. So you may not recognize yourself, that I'm wandering around and I have all these thoughts and this is something new, and you might not recognize what's happening to you, but that's most likely the wandering in a spiritual sense is probably what's happening to you, I think.
Well, it's important to get outside of your comfort zone, right? Like, this is why the practice is there. Like, if we look at the yogic tradition, the yogis will say, if you stay in a place longer than 3 days, like they say 24 hours, but they say you can stretch it out to 3 days, you start to pick up the vasanas, so the latent habits and tendencies of that environment. This is why you often hear this term, you are the environment. And there's a lot of truth to that, because especially energetically, you pick up the kind of the energy of that place. And in some sense, you start to think in accord with that place as well. And so obviously within the yogic tradition, they don't want to pick up any sort of unnecessary vasanas that is going to affect their karma. So they never stay in a place for that long. And even in nature, they don't stay in place for that long. We could say, in arguing with what we're talking about, is that in nature it's okay to stay somewhere for long periods of time, because you don't have anything around you but the birds and the beasts and the trees and everything like that. So, but it's when you're in close to human society is where you start to pick up these vasanas, and you begin to be influenced by the culture of that place. And it's not really, in some sense, it isn't who you truly are. but it's what becomes of your identity. So the whole point of cloud wandering, of wandering the earth, is to dismantle the identity. Yeah. That's the point of the practice.
I think once you're in one environment for a long enough time, you pick up these habits unconsciously, right? So what's happening is that I think you somewhat, when you go from place to place, to settle for a little while, but if you stay a bit longer than how you expected, then you start to kind of accumulating these habits, the vasanas basically. And these vasanas start changing somewhat your intuitive sense as well, I think. Because our intuitive sense takes up most of our decision-making process in our lives. Because we are, feelings and emotions and your mood and these things affect tremendously to make some sort of decision, much more so rational mind.
Yep.
And what this environment does to you is that like you mentioned about energy, the energy of the place and the energy of the people who have been that environment for much longer than you have been, carries certain type of energy and give it to you. That's infectious. It's then you get that energy unconsciously. You start changing your intuitive perspective on things. That gets you some bad habits, some negative habits, right? So, again, you mentioned identity. You start identifying with certain things. You start to have this idea. You accumulate information from the environment unconsciously, and you completely download that program within your subconscious mind. That you start identifying, you start defending that information as if that is you, right?
Yep.
That's when all the problem begins.
Well, that, as you said, with that intuitive layer, that's like the samskaric layer, right? Like the mental impression, subliminal imprints, is that because that's your in some sense nature, but can be changed according to your life process and sort of the experiences that you have in life, and so that is your identity primarily, right?
Yes.
So your intuitive sense, your hot cognition is sort of primarily running the show, right? Our cold cognition is running a small bandwidth of our life, decision making. They're basically our cognitive control centers, where the hot cognition is basically running the show.
Yes.
And so a lot of our decisions are influenced by the hot cognition, which is the intuitive part of our cognition. And so when we're in an environment, we're accumulating these samskaras, right, into the hot cognition. And then we start to act as the environment.
Yes.
So I'm Australian, I'm like this, I'm Christian, and so forth and so on. Whereas you haven't had any sort of distance from that culture to see are you really like that?
Yes.
Why do we change when we're not in our familiar surroundings?
Yes.
We do slowly change, right?
Yes.
And we get, in some sense, subtly influenced by other cultures as well. And sometimes, if you go to cultures where no one speaks your language, you might not even be influenced by that culture at all. So then you'll start to empty out all of these samskaras and vasanas that you've been carrying, right, for a long period of time. And so a lot of our identity is developed from where we are. So the places that we were born, that we live, as you said, it becomes your intuitive center. And, on the spiritual path, especially, when people start to travel or they start to wander, and then they go back to their familiar environment, there's usually a friction with the people that you knew in that familiar environment before you left, and then you've come back to see them, but you've completely changed. And what's happened is you've had all of these different life experiences.
Yes.
That has kind of changed and in some sense emptied out a lot of the old intuitive senses about yourself from the previous environment. And so that's when they see you, like your family or your friends, and they can't really quite make you out. They think, what's something wrong with her? Like she drank the wrong water or something, But that's part of the process, right? And that's why I always tell people, like, don't be so perturbed about your family or your friends being at odds with who you are, especially if you've gone away and you've come back to that familiar environment. Don't be so worried about that, because that's just a natural thing. Because the reason is because they stayed in that environment, right? And because you were in that environment too, you were part of sort of their environment. So they had a version of you that they understood. Then you went away, say, for a couple of years, and you were living in Bodh Gaya in India, and you came back, shanti, shanti, shanti.
Completely different place, yes.
They can't make you out, because the old version that they had of you is gone.
Yeah, those people who stayed in one environment for a very long time, sometimes lifetime, right? That might be most people. But those people tend to assume a person next to you think exactly the same as you do, right? That's the sign that that person probably been in one environment for too long. But I mean, that is a positive result of getting influenced by different environments. When you actually left your familiar environment and go somewhere else, which is actually beneficial to you, with a beneficial culture, beneficial spiritual growth to you, to immerse in that kind of environment. Again, that's what we are talking about here, the roaming, that wandering around the world, basically. Again, like for our experience, we've been to so many different countries, and primarily in Asia, which the place where we got a lot of good influence on us, right? Like most places, very strong Buddhist traditions, or like for somewhere like India has very strong Hindu Vedic influence on us, and that gave us very good effect on our intuitive center and also emotional center in many different ways, right? So that is a result of having a good environment, right environment around you for whatever you are seeking or whatever reason that you chose to be there, right? Again, in a sense that to be in nature, completely isolate from outside world, and to be in nature. The reason why we feel good is because we feel like we are growing just like nature. I mean, we are that, but we have forgotten for a very long time because we live such sophisticated and complex world right now. But in nature, you feel like you become one with the trees and plants, so that you grow with them, grow just like them, right? That you follow the clock of nature, sunrise and sunset, all these kind of things. That your body clock get used to how it's supposed to be, and that's the right environment, the good, nutritious environment for all of us, and to be somewhere like Southeast Asian countries, or India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, those countries which still preserve a very strong their traditional culture, is much more communal. People are their intuitive center and their innocence is still very much alive, and they have such deep respect for other people, whether they're educated or not. That's not
matter.
That's not an issue,
Doesn't matter,
right?
They're human beings.
Exactly. They know how other human beings feel, right? No matter where they're from, they treat with such respect, especially if they meet some other foreigner who happen to be interested in their Indian traditional knowledge. They often pay even more respect, right? So to be in that kind of environment can give you kind of a new life force, really. That you have a completely different perspective on your life, and also life that you lived as well.
Yeah. In those countries, people aren't aggressive in general. Like in the West and developed nations in general, there's an aggressiveness from people being know-it-alls, people who have lost their innocence and who have identified with their identity, right? So those countries still preserve the traditions where they know the identity itself is a fabrication, it's an illusion. It's not that you won't be an identity, but there's not a clinging or an attachment to the identity. And so part of the wandering practice, particularly from our perspective, is that most of our spiritual development was from traveling. Like, I know that people could argue, yeah, but you've stayed in monasteries and ashrams and studied a lot, and look, that's all great too. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but a lot of our spiritual development came through wandering and from visiting these great places, as you said, having a positive influence, accumulating positive vasanas from shanti communities.
Yes.
And one of the things is that, maybe controversial to say for some people, is that if you stay in one location, say your whole life, you don't actually, there's something that you miss because you don't sort of step outside of your comfort zone, because you've sort of resonated with this psychological comfort, which, is kind of analogous to, a caterpillar not turning into the butterfly. So, but when you push yourself outside of your comfort zone, then you start to actually notice psychological and spiritual growth. And a lot of people who stay in one location forever don't ever experience that. And you know what those people are exactly like, because you know the environment, and so you know that they're not going to be at the level of where you have been if you've traveled to, say, 150 countries and spent, let's say, 3 or 4 years away from your familiar, your birth country, for example.
Yes.
And so they're not going to be at that level. And that's why this practice was designed. Because even back in the day, the yogis and the Taoist hermits and the early Buddhists and Jains, they understood that the people who were always staying in their familiar location kind of weren't developing at the speed of people who are actually moving around and absorbing other cultures and so forth and so on. And so we know this historically when we look at the countries who their cultures intermingled. So if we look at the history of the Silk Road, right?
Yes.
A lot of people say, why do places like China and India and Greece and Northern Africa and everywhere develop a lot quicker than other parts of the world? It's because of this exchange of culture and sharing of ideas, which actually develops and advances not just the individual spiritual growth, but like the collective spiritual growth. And so, but if we take it back down to the microcosm of an individual, that's what we're on our own Silk Road.
Yes.
When you leave your familiar environment, and so you have the positive influence from other cultures, and you may get negatively influenced by other cultures, but you're constantly learning in the process. Yes. It's not a state of stagnation. See, when you're in your own familiar environment, it's kind of a state of stagnation because you never sort of experience anything different. And some people, that is for some people, right? Like I had a friend the other day, and she said she never wants to even leave Queensland. And it's kind of hard for me to believe. Like,
don't want to even leave the state you're in.
Yeah, doesn't feel a need to. And so, and that's for her. It's not for me. But first chance I got to leave Queensland when I was a kid, I was out the door. So you know what I mean. So it's horses for courses in that regard. But if you're talking about sort of your own spiritual development, psychological as well, then wandering like a cloud and being like a shramana or a yogi is very beneficial to the spiritual practice.
Yes. I mean, again, there are so many people in the world right now, isn't it? Like, so everyone's different, but I'm not so sure as long as you were born as a human form, people are different, but in human evolution, since the dawn of our ancestor, to get to 21st century of today, without roaming or wandering, like
we would be nowhere.
That's the thing. Like, let's say most recent human evolutionary history is 300,000 to 500,000 years ago, right? Roaming and wandering wasn't even an option for our ancestors because they had to keep traveling to find the food and shelters and find the right climate, right? But that's how we developed our brain, and that's the process of our history. Like, that's how we got to invent little tools, right?
Cultural evolution.
That's exactly right. That's how we got to this the stage of the human history right now.
Yep.
So that roaming and wandering is essential, if not the most important part of our evolution. You know? If that affected us on biological evolution as well as cultural evolution, then just think about it, like you mentioned about microcosmic level, what that does to an individual, for example. For an individual to go through this roaming, wandering process of own growth, personal growth, that is a small scale of evolution as well. And you are writing your own little history, a personal history as well. So to get to make that advanced and get more growth, wandering and roaming is a so important part of our life.
Exactly.
So I do get it, probably not for everybody, but maybe it is for everybody, because we are all same species. Yeah. We all operate the same. We feel the same suffering, pain, happy, and joy. We all feel these things. So I don't know if there would be any exception.
No, you're exactly right, love, because if you think about it, we've probably all been the person who was stuck in our environment and thought, why leave, right? Why leave? But then once you do leave, you become addicted to more travel and experiencing more. And it is for everyone. The difference is the motivation for people to move and get out of their familiar environments, their comfort zone, is a lot different, right? It's kind of interesting because if you look at America, for example, a lot of people, in some sense, don't really leave America. I mean, we see a lot of Americans traveling, but in typically Americans like to stay in America. And I've heard a lot of, when we've been there, we've heard a lot of Americans say, why would we ever travel? Like, this is the best country, and so forth and so on. You know, so, and ironically, Americans are very identity-based.
Yeah.
Because they never leave, sometimes not even their state. And I know that's common around the world as well, but it's very common within the States, where their culture is so focused on identity. Everything is about identity in America. And that's why it can be exhausting for people outside of America to listen to the dialogue and so forth and so on. And so Americans, in some senses, particularly now, they suffer from this collective consciousness that's happening at the moment. But it's interesting that, because we are friends with a lot of Americans, and we see a lot of Americans in India and Thailand in general, and a lot of them, we see the effects of wandering because they lose their beliefs, their American beliefs, they lose their political beliefs, and everyday life is just more important for them. Their immediate reality, seeing the joy of the street dogs in Thailand, or going to Ramana Ashram, and these things are way more important to them because it's in their face. And so that's like my point is that it can affect anybody, this wandering. And so usually when you're in an area, you start to, because you think like that place, you have the beliefs of that place, you have the political views of that place, and they're all not your own. You borrowed them from the external environment. They're not yours on your own. You borrowed them. And so all of the Americans we know overseas, they've kind of shunned all of those beliefs because they're free of them, Yeah. Particularly during the pandemic, we know some Americans in Thailand and that who had not even been paying attention to what was happening in the States. And why should you, right? I never paid attention to anything in Australia when I was living overseas, and I still don't pay attention here. But but it's like you don't have an obligation to pay attention to what's, again, that's another sense of identity. You should know what's happening in your home country, in air quotes.
You should care. You
should care. When your inalienable right as a human being is to wander free and not to be annexed and boxed in by the illusion of a nation.
I think when you're in one environment for a long period of time, it gives you a sense of ownership and responsibility. again, that is the identity that leads to that strong identity that becomes the foundation of the identity. So you never get a chance to be an observer to your own life, right? You're always a doer. Right? You are the one that actually leading the action, right?
Yep.
You are the one that making the decision and leading the action and yet materialize something in your life, right? But what happens when you start wonder is for the first time in your life you become a witness, I think. Because let's say going to somewhere like India, a completely different environment from everywhere else in the world, right? You become literally become a witness, seeing the panoramic view of the 3D because you're right in it. You see the view of the world that you're in that moment, that reality is just completely different from what you're used to, right? So you start paying attention to things. You become a witness of your life in that reality. From being in that, almost like in a third party, you're becoming you're just looking over what's happening around you. That gives you already different perspective in your life. You're not an owner of the way you think you are. We're not actually, essentially. But you're not an owner of your life anymore. You're not decision maker anymore. Why? Because you are in a completely different environment. You got to learn everything from the beginning again, right? Because different society, things function different way, right? So you need to learn to navigate through from becoming a good witness.
Yep.
If you don't become a good witness, what happens? We see a lot in those countries. They trying to change things in their way.
That's right.
In place like India or Nepal, Thailand,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
But they have their own way to do things. Sometimes maybe you need to, respect a little bit their way.
Yep.
Or just to take a little step back and become a witness, just see how they do things. Maybe there's something that you can learn from, right? Maybe not as productive or efficient as how you would usually do, but just to become a pure witness to the situation will give you tremendous wisdom or some different technique, or I don't know. So like kind of you allow yourself to become a pure witness and making a little gap between you as a doer to the life, to outside reality, that allows you to have a different perspective about everything, including yourself.
And you have a gap between you and your old beliefs.
Wow.
You're not just witnessing the environment, you're witnessing how you are reacting to the new environment with your old beliefs.
Exactly.
And so what happens is you realize that your old beliefs don't work in this new environment. So you're witnessing kind of this conflict, right? And we've experienced this a few times. There was one time when we moved from Chiang Mai to Tiruvannamalai, and we were cozy in Chiang Mai for a long time. We hadn't been back to Tiruvannamalai for a long time. And we were going there for sadhana and just shanti for 4 months, right? And when we first got there, there was a bit of a conflict because we had become accustomed to a certain way. And we sort of were fighting that. We went to Pondicherry and then we realized, let's go back to Tiru. Like we're playing around, right? So, and it's interesting what you said, where people go and they go to these new environments, and because people have a different way of doing things, they try to change other people because they think that their version of reality, according to their cultural beliefs and according to their identity, is the way it is.
Yes.
And it's not. And this is where Christians get confused, right? Because as you mentioned with Nepal, India, Thailand specifically, those 3 countries are a prime target for Christians. And we see a lot of missionaries there who go there and they try to undermine the Hindus and the Buddhists and make fun of them and this and that, which is very violent and disgusting actually. But they have a version of reality that they actually think is the version for all people.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not the version for all people. And it's hard to get people out of that way of thinking. I get people on the channel a lot, right? They will ask me about Eastern spirituality, and they say they're interested, but then they will say something, yeah, but in the Bible it says this, and Jesus said this. It's like, but you're still taking that as the authority. You're still that has no sway on the Hindus. And so if you are saying that's the authority, you're saying the entire nation of India are sinners, because they have a different cultural framework, a different spiritual makeup. And your silly doctrine that says all non-believers go to hell, it's ridiculous, right? So and so people can't get out of that. And I get it on the channel, as you know, all the time. People say, yeah, but I really like Vedanta, for example, but Jesus said this and this and that. And it's like, but you're still taking it as the authority. You need to move it off the pedestal, because it's not on the pedestal. It's a cultural trait. It's a cultural religion that became that was part of European culture. But that doesn't have... European culture is not better than Indian culture or Chinese culture or South American culture or African culture. Why are you assuming that this cultural evolution through Europe is the be-all and end-all, like the final line on things? Like, we analyze Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism through the lens of Christianity because that's the authority. It's not the authority. It's part of a cultural evolution of one part of the world, not the whole world. And then Christians will say, yeah, but Jesus is the Son of God, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but other places have stories as well, different mythologies, that they can too say that to fire back at you. And this is where religious fundamentalism comes from. See, it comes from that solidified identity. This is where extremism comes from, where radicals are born. And so you should always go to somewhere with a blank canvas.
Yes.
And observe, even if you are Christian, say if you go to India, observe your Christian mentality interacting with the way Hindus do things. Because it's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
So what you've got to learn to do is be flexible. You've got to learn to drift like a cloud and flow like water, like unsui. So this is very important in the spiritual practice. This is much more important than a silly doctrine. It is. It's much more important than a religion or a silly doctrine. It's about the spiritual liberation of yourself from your identity. 100%.
Yeah. Since the dawn of Christianity, again, the principle behind the Christianity came from before that, from Greece. But yeah, since the dawn of Christianity, these process of monopolizing culture around the world has been slowly happening, right? Yeah. That people wouldn't accept the Christianity as a culture, but if it dictates way of thinking and way of perceiving the world, a way you make up your own opinion, then it is somewhat a culture to the world. And that in everywhere, like even little habits of thinking or habits of doing things could come from that very influence of Christian way of thinking. And that basically monopolized the world, unfortunately. And that is why what's happening even within India, unfortunately, between small portion of people, is that they try to disprove Hindu culture, which is, I find it quite ridiculous. So unfortunately, that's what's happening. But again, like as to spiritual wandering and roaming, once, as you mentioned earlier, like when you get dropped into completely different, there is a bit of a friction, right? But once we learn to navigate through, when we give ourselves a little bit of gap between us as a person who have these habits and conditions from other world to this new reality, then you give the gap between that person to this world, then you get to see the world a little bit more transparent. And that gap transfer into your own inner self as well, so that outer world experience, whatever you're going through, reflects on your inner world process as well. That is why this wandering element is very important. If you don't wonder, you never get to learn about yourself, right? You're stagnant and basically rotting in one place, and that's what's actually happening within yourself as well. But if you were to go out to the world, or go out to the wilderness, explore different culture, meeting completely different people, you get to learn the way they think, the way they see the world, then that's also what's happening inside of you as well. Things become a bit new, things become more fresh, and you get to realize how much more you didn't know.
So what people get addicted to is psychological comfort. So they stay in their familiar surroundings. They stay within their familiar culture because it makes them feel safe, the illusion of safety, right? Without ever peeking out over the fence to see, well, I wonder what's over there. They don't have any of that sort of curiosity because of the psychological comfort. They're addicted to psychological comfort. And so the spiritual traditions, they understand that, and they're trying to, in some sense, give you some motivation to get out and experience the world, get out of your comfort zone, get out of the psychological comfort that you're addicted to, and get into a world of uncertainty. Because it's in uncertainty that we grow. Remember Alan Watts' book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. So which is a lot about uncertainty and getting out there. But we've bought into this illusion that freedom is within security. So it's within psychological comfort, and it's not really. Freedom is, it's about getting out of your comfort zone and moving around and growing spiritually, as you mentioned. And this is why, if you're with a master, they will, sometimes guide you on a path like this. If we look at northern India, for example, if we go into Uttarakhand and places like that, like around Rishikesh, you will see vision quests and that with a proper yogi that you can go on, and we've seen some people coming back from maybe a 4 or 5 month vision quest, and it might be a European guy, and he's got beard and he's a string bean, there's no meat left on him. And so these traditions are still being kept alive. We have an older gentleman friend in Tiruvannamalai who would share stories with us about his old master, and said that he would get on, his master was very unpredictable. And so they'd be having a satsang one day, and then they'd go for a walk, and then the master would just jump on a carriage of a train going somewhere. And so they have to get on with him. And because
completely off the cuff.
He would always say his master passed away, and because our friend is a bit older. And so, but he said that when he was living, that, off the cuff, life was just completely unpredictable all the time. If there's an empty carriage or a train, he jumps on, doesn't ask where the train's going. He's just going to go, and when he feels like to jump off, he'll jump off, and then and so he said that it was actually the greatest time of his life. He said there was a real joyousness in not having certainty, not having that security of I know what's coming next. There was a real freedom in not knowing what's coming next, and you're just being led by the guru. And who knows what the guru is unpredictable. You 1 minute having satsang, next minute you're on a boat going over to Sri Lanka, and you're just what the hell's going on here?
Wherever you got to, let that be your destination.
Exactly. Exactly. And the point of that is, as we said, because the more you wander, the more formless you become, the more the layers get peeled away. And this is what the master is doing. This is what was happening with our friend. The master had lived their life like that, and even they were still in the process of cloud wandering. They're still roaming, maybe not all the time, but let's say 80-20, right? And so the more you wander, the more the layers peel away. And that's the point. And then you don't have a form or an energetic quality to your your being. Because your identity is kind of a bit lucid, and I can kind of see through it. I know, for example, I look at you and think you're Korean and so forth and so on, but I can't quite make you out because I don't have a form or you don't have a belief structure. This is what happens when you wander, right? Because those layers peel away. I can't quite make it out.
Yes.
What's going on here?
Yes. I mean, as I was preparing for this topic, what really came to me strongly was that, like, stronger your identity is, less aware you are.
Yeah. Yep.
So, on the other hand, as you mentioned, if you're lucid and your identity is not completely formless, it's not there, you don't have such socialized conditioned identity, then you become more free, you become more aware. That's what's really happening, right?
Yeah.
And again, when it comes to the freedom, when people say, I have a freedom to do this and freedom to choose to, eat something or do whatever, that's just apparent choice. That's not really freedom. That's just the options.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think when we have too many options, which we do, right? Even when you go to online platform, which one are you going to jump on first?
Like in a supermarket.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So more options you have, actually it becomes a burden to you. But I don't think many people know it. Actually, it is a burden to you. People are quite unaware of it, and let that be your stress. Actually, and you get stressed out.
Well, too many options is complexity.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And complexity, things become more complicated, right? Yep. And you're lost, really. And that's actually what's happening to a lot of people, I believe. Yep. So, so that is a burden. So what the step that we need to take is, again, you gotta be unpredictable. You gotta actually completely get out of that, comfort zone, that place that you live in, externally and also internally, more so internally, actually. You need to get out of that head space, that way of thinking, that way of framing your mind a little bit. You gotta jump off that and then kind of channel to a completely different way. Just be unpredictable, and unpredictability give you such big excitements too in life, because you're always in some sort of motion. Things are different, things are always fresh.
Well, the freedom that most people talk about is the freedom for their identity to move around and have choice and this and that. What you realize with cloud wandering is freedom is, well, when there's no identity, you are freedom itself.
Exactly.
So, which is kind of a reflection of actually your wandering too, isn't it, a little bit? And, and we live in an age, right, where people are actually, for whatever reason, well, we know why, against people having freedom these days, which is our inalienable right as a human to have freedom. Freedom to move about, this is what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, restrictions. We've been having too much restrictions recently,
the
last couple of years.
Yeah, so, and for whatever reason, some people actually want restrictions. But, so the thing is that when you break out of that idea of your identity's version of freedom, you begin to live freedom or be freedom itself, because you're not then boxed in by your identity. You kind of, your mind is free from the environmental and external restrictions that have been imposed upon you from birth. And so you begin to be free of that. We've got to remember the nature of the mind is empty, spontaneous, and free. And so we should be a reflection of those three qualities. A lot of us aren't, but this is what cloud wandering can do, or wandering like a cloud can do. You begin to be a reflection of being empty, spontaneous, and free. And as you were mentioning with awareness, like awareness is naturally there. We're always pure awareness. It's just the identity that eclipses it. you're always the Atman, the self. You're always the uncarved block or the original face. But it's the identity that eclipses that, which then keeps us a prisoner in our mind. Identity is a type of prison when you think about it.
It is.
Because you have these beliefs, right, that are borders in your mind. So when you have other information come into your field of consciousness, or other beliefs or other cultural influences, and you are unable to kind of assimilate them and to deal with them, that means you're living inside your own prison.
Yes.
Where
you're limited.
You are limited. You've got to break those walls down.
Yes.
In the Brahma Vidya tradition, the science of the absolute, so studying Brahman and Tao, or Shunyata in Buddhism, you will not be accepted into a lineage or a sangha if you still have the walls. You have had to have done some sort of deconstruction of your conditioning for the guru or the master to even allow you into the same room as them. Because you can't give that sort of knowledge, the Brahma Vidya,
right,
to those sorts of, to people who, like as Jesus said, right, don't, cast your pearls before swine. Before swine.
Yeah.
And so it's the same with the Brahma Vidya. The science of the absolute is the highest knowledge you can have. And so if you're going to give that to a guy down at the bar, it's meaningless and may even disrupt their life and may even disturb them and may cause them to be violent. And so this is why the wandering is important, and this is why sometimes pilgrimages and that have to happen for certain people on the spiritual path, because they need to shed a few layers to even go to a deeper level of understanding. So a lot of us are trying to get to a deeper level of understanding spirituality, but we haven't even gone through any sort of processes like this to wander like a cloud or to peel away the layers of our identity.
Yes.
We want to experience spirituality through our identity by remaining in our familiar environment. And it's like, you can't do it. You wouldn't be able to study the Brahma Vidya at any depth. You just wouldn't be able to. Because you'd be constantly seeing it through the lens that you've been conditioned with. And this is why peeling that conditioning away is very important.
That is very important. And again, with the identity, not only identity of certain title, but also with your emotions as well, I think, because the memories that you get to accumulate over time in a one place, internally, you start to build this emotional reaction to a certain circumstance or situation that you encounter. So you start having this emotional reaction, and you let that make it part of your identity as well. I'm this type of person. I get angry when this happened, like this sort of reaction. Like you start to identify yourself with a certain emotional state, which is also quite silly in a sense, and also it can be very harmful for you in a long term as well. So start having that detachment is very important. And detachment from your own emotion also means detachment from your environment as well, even from your family and friends as well. If you don't feel right with the certain things, even from your close people, you have no obligation to make it work.
No.
It's more tiresome and more stressful, and it's harmful for you. And think, and you gotta be a bit aimless too. Like you gotta go out for a walk aimlessly. Let wherever you get to be your destination. Yeah, you just start just gotta start wander around, right? Yeah. Literally.
Hit the road.
Yeah, hit the road. Yes, hit the road.
Might be a bit difficult right at this minute, but when you can, hit the road. We might see you on the road.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, simply just don't make plans. Don't have plans.
No.
Just go out through your day. Depends on how you feel in that very moment. And get out there, go for a walk aimlessly, see where you end up, and watch what's happening inside you. Right?
like what you said with and I've mentioned this before on the podcast before with friends and families and whatnot. And I do agree with Prabhupada when he said that it doesn't matter what your friends and family say, the spiritual practice should be number one. If that's not number one, everything else that you have in your life
doesn't matter. Yeah, nothing really
and it doesn't
matters.
function properly.
Yeah.
Because you're not making what is number one.
Yes.
You're leaving it back at third, fourth, fifth.
Yeah.
You're neglecting the spiritual path, your development as an individual, but to appease other people, to keep that image that people have of you fresh in those. So you're a hostage then.
Yes.
You're a hostage to your friends and families, projections of you. Never be a hostage of your friends and family's projections. You must make the spiritual practice your number one. And wandering like a cloud, being a shramana is a way of doing that.
Yes.
Is keeping it number one.
Exactly. If you have to sacrifice certain things to get there, let it be.
Let it be. Sacrifice is part of the spiritual process.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.